Movie adaptations of Stephen King stories have always been exceptionally hit or miss. On one hand, you have works of cinematic genius such as The Green Mile, Stand By Me, and The Shawshank Redemption, and on the other, you have, well, let's just say less favourable attempts like The Langoliers, Sleepwalkers, and Maximum Overdrive. But one adaptation that I find myself gravitating towards every once in a while is Misery. Directed by Rob Reiner, who had previously directed the excellent coming-of-age movie Stand By Me, Misery tells the story of author Paul Sheldon, a world-renowned novelist famous for his Victorian romance novel series by the same name, but it's a franchise that he's not particularly proud of. The latest book, which is due to be released within days, is the final one in the Misery series where he kills off the main character and thus kills off the franchise. After staying in Silver Creek, Colorado to finish off his brand new and wholly different novel, he sets off on his drive back to New York City but is caught in a freak blizzard that causes him to have a near-fatal car accident. When he regains consciousness, he finds himself bedridden in an unfamiliar house with multiple broken bones and other injuries, and discovers that he was rescued by a local nurse called Annie Wilkes, who also proclaims to be his #1 fan. Things seem to be going okay for the most part, but when Paul lets Annie read his latest book that he's been working on, Annie freaks out about the profanity that's in it and her erratic temper gets the best of her. She apologises, but this puts Paul right on edge. Things don't get any better when Annie purchases the latest Misery novel and discovers that her beloved character has been killed off. She flies into a terrifying fit of rage and informs Paul that from this point on he's her prisoner. Annie then forces Paul into writing her a new Misery novel, one where he brings her beloved character back to life, and if he doesn't deliver a masterpiece, then Paul is in for a very bad ride. To my mind, I don't think anyone else then or even now could have played Annie Wilkes as perfectly as Kathy Bates did. She won the Oscar for her performance as this terrifying, erratic and dark character that even to this day sits in the upper echelons of some of the best acting that I've ever had the pleasure of watching. She was somehow able to have this switch that she could flip at the drop of a dime that could turn her from a normal, even warm and inviting person into something that I can only best describe as non-human. With immediacy, the life would just vanish from her face and even her eyes, leaving nothing but dark storm clouds filled with terrible malevolence. She encapsulates everything that makes us scared of violent and unpredictable individuals, and it's a performance that just needs to be seen. The movie drip feeds us vital information on who Annie is and what she's actually capable of, and her violence escalates at each step, reaching its shocking and visceral peak in the hobbling scene. Even now, I always wince and recoil when that sledgehammer slams against his ankle, and it's made all the more horrific thanks to Annie being so calm, even joyful as she commits this awful act. It was changed from the book where instead Annie chops Paul's foot off with an axe and cauterises the wound with a blowtorch, but for me, I think the movie version is just equally as shocking. Annie Wilkes is one of cinema's greatest villains and will forever be remembered as such. James Caan does a terrific job as Paul Sheldon. He's got this tough, gritty and wise persona but radiates politeness and gratitude. When he's first taken in by Annie, he's very thankful and despite his predicament, he's relatively relaxed. But when he begins to see who she really is and what she's capable of, then the panic sets in and he realises that he's got to try and escape at all costs. Caan finds a great balance with Paul in showing us when he's nervous or truly terrified, but also in bringing out this reluctance to capitulate to Annie's will from time to time. His acting is on point, especially during scenes where he has to show he's in great pain, both physically and emotionally. The scene where Annie forces Paul to burn his latest book always sticks out for me in this regard. Try as he might to convince her that he has multiple copies of it, Annie bests him with her knowledge that Paul never makes copies of a new book because of his superstitions. He realises that he's been beat in this fight and for the sake of self-preservation, he burns it. The look in his eyes as he watches something he's proud of going up in flames really hits me, and it's one of Caan's more subtle but impactful pieces of acting. William Goldman's screenplay is tight, focused and very well balanced. Its runtime of 1 hour and 45 minutes is perfect and it never feels like a trudge to get through. The problem with movies that take place in predominantly one location and with only a limited number of characters is that it runs the risk of becoming boring and stale. Goldman makes the best of the limited space of Annie's house. I love the scenes where Paul manages to escape his room to find ways out, weapons, or even clues as to who Annie really is, and these scenes are brought to life by Rob Reiner's brilliant directing, which I'll get to shortly. To stop us tiring of just two main characters, Goldman's script introduces us to the local Sheriff Buster, Annie's wife and co-worker Virginia, and the pair add some very welcome levity and humour in between the movie's more intense and horrific moments. The banter they have with each other as this older married couple always does its job of cracking a little laugh for me every time I see it, but it never feels out of place, forced, or unnecessary. Every horror thriller film needs these types of moments to help even out the more demanding scenes, and in Misery, this pair definitely helped do that. To say that Rob Reiner had never directed a horror thriller before this, he did a spectacular job. After the success of the magnificent Stand By Me, Stephen King only agreed to sell the movie rights to Misery if Rob was hired to either produce or direct. He studied Hitchcock's movies extensively to make sure he got into the right headspace to make a movie of this type, and that dedication is blatant to see. Those close-ups of Kathy Bates' face when she's kicking off, along with the angles and the lighting, really drive home her psychopathy and ramps up the tension within its audience, or at least it certainly did for me. As I mentioned before, those scenes where Paul manages to get out of his room, in particular that first one when he's trying to escape, are so tense that your heart feels like it's in your mouth. He makes brilliant use of the location too, and his house is set in the gorgeous surrounds of some stunning scenery, and that view from Paul's room looking out towards it all is perfectly captured. Special mention to the set design here too. Annie's house is creepily inviting. You can definitely tell that a lot of thought and care went into designing and decorating it, from all the little trinkets, ornaments and clutter, to the house's dour but surprisingly cosy decor. It all comes together to give us an insight in some ways to Annie's dark and twisted mind. Misery is a classic, not just in its genre but as a movie overall, and arguably one of the best adaptations ever made. In over 30 years since its release, it still manages to get in your head and continues to scare and shock after all of this time. Give it a go if you've not seen it yet. I guarantee you certainly won't be able to look at sledgehammers in the same way ever again.